Okay, I'm not going to stand up because I think that if I stand up, it's kind of like being quite a bit superior and talking down to people. I'd rather be on your level. I'd like to first introduce, this is Tim Dieppe. He works with Equal and Free. Now, unfortunately, Baroness Cox, who was supposed to be here, has been called out to Armenia, and there's absolutely nothing that's out of my control, although I do intend to tie her down for the next one. But he's got a statement from Baroness Cox, which I'm going to get him to read out first. Then, obviously, we have Caitlin here, myself. Rahil Raza is flown in from Canada, which I have to say thank you very much. I can't thank you enough for doing that. And the lady who hasn't quite found her seat yet is a lady called Roma. Now, it's a Muslim lady who suffered Sharia law in this country. So I think it's really important. So I'm going to start with, if we can have Tim first.
My name is Tim Dieppe. I work with Equal and Free for Baroness Cox. Baroness Cox supporting her initiatives in Parliament and elsewhere, particularly in relation to Islam and Sharia law, which you will hear about as I read her statement. Apologies, I was late because I followed the wrong postcode on my sat-nav. I got to the wrong place in really good time. So blame me for that.
I do.
Thank you. But anyway, it's great to be here. I've got a statement from Baroness Cox to read. I also work for Christian Concern, just so you know, and my role there is focusing on Islamic affairs and Islamic relations, and we're very concerned about the influence of Islam in this country, as I think all of us in this room are. So I've got a statement from Baroness Cox. I will read it. It will take me about 15 minutes to read it, okay, because it's quite a long statement. So just to prepare you for that, okay, I'm going to read it as animated as possible. It is very interesting. There's lots of good stuff in it, but I apologize, I do have to read it rather than just sort of state it to you. Okay, so warm greetings to you all who are attending this important meeting convened by Marias. I greatly regret that I'm unable to be with you in person. I received a last-minute and urgent request to visit Armenia this weekend as it seeks to transform its economic potential and long-term security. I have visited Armenia 85 times in some of their darkest days following the horrific earthquake which killed 25,000 people. I am therefore sending this statement to indicate why I support so much of what is being undertaken by Tony and her vision for Marias. I share many deep concerns, some of which I'm sure you'll already be aware of. Today, however, I wish to focus on just one in particular, that is the growth of Sharia councils in the UK. What are Sharia courts? Without going into too much detail, it's probably worth providing a little bit of background information. The forums, which are commonly referred to as Sharia courts or Sharia councils, appear to operate in a number of guises around the UK. Some fall within the arbitration framework, which means they are able to make legally binding decisions in legitimate arbitration proceedings. Others are constituted as arbitration tribunals, but operate outside their legitimate scope. Still others have little or no legal status, but often operate within particular communities as if they had the power to make authoritative binding rulings. In a free society, individuals must be able to organise their affairs according to their own principles, whether religious or otherwise. But attempting to operate a parallel legal jurisdiction is a serious cause for concern. We cannot condone situations where rulings are applied which are fundamentally incompatible with our country's laws, values, principles and policies. So what are the main concerns? Although women from any faith tradition or no faith tradition may suffer abuse and other problems associated with dysfunctional families, the plight of those in Islamic communities can be exacerbated by the application of established Sharia law principles which inherently discriminate against women and girls. To quote from Theresa May directly speaking when she was Home Secretary, quote, "There is evidence of women being, quote, divorced under Sharia law and left in penury, wives who are forced to return to abusive relationships because Sharia councils say a husband has a right to chastise, and Sharia councils giving testimony of a woman only half the weight of a testimony of a man," end quote. In other words, they may promote gender discrimination, inflicting suffering on many Muslim women which would make our suffragettes turn in their graves. Perhaps just as important, the operation of some of these councils threaten liberal democracy's fundamental principle of one law for all. Having spoken to countless Muslim women about these concerns, here are some examples of gender discrimination. Firstly, unilateral divorce. A husband is able to divorce his wife by saying, "I divorce you," 3 times. But women have to obtain permission from religious authority, often a Sharia council or court. They may have to pay money and also fulfill other conditions. Sometimes their husbands will not give them the money, so they're trapped in their marriage. One lady described to me how in theory she could obtain a divorce, but as she could not obtain the money, she felt as though she was in a room with an open door to freedom but tied to a chair, so she could not walk out to enjoy that freedom. Usually the husband does not have to pay anything to obtain his divorce. When I asked an imam why a man does not have to pay any money, indicating that it takes two people to divorce, I never received a reply. Secondly, polygamy. Under Sharia law, a husband is entitled to up to 4 wives, providing he takes responsibility for making appropriate provision for them all. In many Muslim communities in this country, polygamy is commonplace, although as a nation, bigamy is legally forbidden. A report written by a courageous Muslim woman, Habiba Jan, entitled Equal and Free, 50 Muslim Women Experiences of Marriage in Britain, describes the marital situation of 50 Muslim women in the West Midlands. Many were married in polygamous marriages and said their husbands failed to provide financial support in contravention of Islamic teaching. Some were not even aware they were being married into a polygamous relationship. Many are desperately unhappy. Thirdly, discriminatory inheritance provisions. A girl or woman usually receives only half of any amount left to a boy or a man. Next, the implicit sanctioning of physical violence. To cite just one example, you might remember a few years ago, a BBC Panorama investigation which uncovered evidence of Sharia councils in Britain putting Muslim women at risk by pressuring them to stay in abusive marriages. The programme showed an Islamic scholar at Leighton Islamic Sharia Council telling an undercover reporter to only report domestic abuse to the police as a last resort. When the footage was shown to Nazir Afzal, the then Chief Crown Prosecutor for the North West and himself a Muslim, he said, "I'm disappointed but not surprised. Most of them, these Sharia councils, are fine, but there are some clearly like this who are putting women at risk." A further example of gender discrimination is related to the custody of children following divorce. Sharia law may require children to be given into the custody of their fathers once they reach a certain age. This is in contravention of UK policy, which requires decisions on custody to be made according to the principle of the best interests of the child. In Habiba Jan's study, Muslim women said they wished they had known that Islamic marriage is not recognised as a legal marriage according to British law, and that therefore, for example, they have no rights if they're subsequently divorced by their husband. This leaves them and their children without any rights in law if they're divorced. Many say they are not told that the religious marriage does not simultaneously provide for a legal marriage. Others say their husbands-to-be and or the families discourage them from obtaining a legal marriage. This, of course, leaves the husband free to practice polygamy without breaking the law against bigamy. A related respect of these practices of polygamy and unequal access to divorce is the number of children which one man may have. Several Muslim women have told me that men in their communities may each have up to 20 children. This clearly paves the way for children growing up in dysfunctional families who may become very vulnerable to marginalisation and potential radicalisation. What is more, there can be immense pressure on Muslim women who live in close communities not to seek outside professional help, which could be deemed to bring shame or dishonour to their families and communities. To raise awareness of the seriousness of these problems, I have introduced a private member's bill which has twice been debated in the House of Lords. It has considerable support from all sides of the House, but was opposed by the government on the grounds that every citizen has full and free access to the laws of the land. As already said, this is manifestly untrue, as many vulnerable Muslim women are ignorant of their legal rights and may live in very close communities with tremendous pressure from families not to seek outside professional help, which would bring shame on the community. The bill seeks to address some of these problems by trying to ensure that all women know their rights under law in this country. All my concerns are based on first-hand testimonies from Muslim women and those committed to trying to help them. Time does not allow me to tell the harrowing accounts which I've heard from women which have compelled me to use the privilege of being in the House of Lords of the British Parliament to try to raise awareness of suffering which should never be allowed in our country today. One woman told me, "I feel betrayed by Britain. I came here to get away from this, and the situation is worse here than in the country I escaped from." I'll be pleased to provide further evidence, including some of the horrific situations that have been described to me or are on the record in other places, as well as to receive further evidence in order to challenge our government to take appropriate measures to ensure protection for all citizens of our country, the promotion of the human rights of all people, especially vulnerable girls and women, and the punishment of all who break our laws. Before concluding, I must emphasise my fundamental commitment to the essential freedom of religion and belief as enshrined in Article 18 of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. If women are genuinely happy to accept these provisions of Sharia law, then they have every right to do so. However, where women and girls involuntarily suffer as a result of the policies and practices of Sharia law, either because of family or community pressure, or because they're not aware of their rights in this country, this should be a matter of concern in a country committed to the eradication of unacceptable gender discrimination and the promotion of gender equality. While respecting freedom of religion and cultural diversity, I do not believe we should allow these to override the law of our land, or to deny women the knowledge of their rights and the freedom to access them, looking the other way while they suffer in our country where we have responsibility to protect and promote fundamental freedoms and gender equality. In conclusion, given the suffering of literally countless Muslim women in our country today, I respect Marius's commitment to try to raise awareness of this totally unacceptable situation and to provide a lifeline for these women. Also, I respect the need to raise awareness of the threat to our democracy of allowing a parallel, quasi-legal system which threatens the fundamental principle of one law for all. And I respect Tony's genuine commitment to create a forum which will make it acceptable to discuss these threats to the fundamental values of our society. There is a growing concern in many areas over the problems which Marius seeks to address, but an anxiety over a lack of public space in which to do so without being labelled as Islamophobic, racist, extremist, etc. I therefore hope that Marius can provide an arena where people who share these concerns, including courageous Muslim women, can come together to identify problems, put concerns and experiences on the record, work to enable citizens of this country to live together in harmony, promote the rights of all citizens, protect those who are vulnerable, and enable all who live to live in safety according to the laws of this land. This is why I've introduced my bill into the House of Lords, which would introduce measures to address at least some of these concerns. And this is why I support the fundamental objectives of Marius, as I understand them, as they reflect these concerns and proposed solutions. I am pleased to send my best wishes to all who gather here to promote these endeavours, and I passionately hope we can work together to ensure we pass on the fundamental freedoms which we've inherited undiminished to our children and children's children. Thank you.
If I can ask everybody now, because Caitlin doesn't speak particularly loud, I will turn that ever so slightly round to her. If I can ask everybody to try and keep as quiet as possible. Now, what I like that she's done is she's written virtually a diary from pretty much when we met, isn't it? From her own experience up to present date. So if you can just bear with me. Do you want something? Because I know how you like it. So for everybody, this is Caitlin. Caitlin was groomed and raped by hundreds of Muslim men. So when you're ready.
I was very young when it started. I have a very fuzzy memory of the very beginning. My childhood friend remembers me being picked up from a primary school by an older man and being given ketamine, coming home completely out of it, with lots of new underwear. So it began earlier than I remember. My parents worked a lot, so they weren't really around to notice anything. My friend did at some point tell my parents, but I'm not sure when she did that. We ended up moving areas, but not too far. Can't get any louder than that. My earliest clear memory starts around 13, 14. We had moved house and I was waiting to be accepted into a school, from what I remember. This man, the very same man picking me up from primary school, came to my parents' home while they were out working, and while my brother was at his school. It was a morning. His name was Jason. I don't know if he was a Muslim. He was 28 or in his early 30s. I was quite naive. He had come to take photos of me for a modelling portfolio. At least that's what he said. They ended up being pictures in my underwear. Eventually he said we needed a different environment and asked if there was a bedroom we could use. I took him to my parents' bedroom. I thought nothing of it. I didn't realise that it would get worse. He took more pictures. Then he told me to take everything off and gave me some stockings to put on. I remember the feeling of my stomach turning over. I was really scared, but I did as I was told. As far as I'm aware, I had never been naked in front of a man before then. It's hard to know for sure with what my friend has recently told me about the ketamine. Anyway, more pictures were taken. After a while, I heard my brother come through the door with his friends. It would have been school lunch time. I panicked, jumped up and held the door shut. I shouted at him not to come up the stairs as I had just got out of the bar. By the time I turned around, Jason had taken off his clothes. Again, I was shocked. I'd never seen a naked man before. In fact, I'd never even kissed a boy. I felt myself going red with embarrassment. I told him he would have to go as soon as my brother left. He told me I better be quiet, or my brother would hear me, and my parents would find out what I had been up to. He forced himself onto me and raped me. I remember him laughing and saying to me, "You're a virgin, aren't you?" I'll never forget the smug look on his face in that moment. When he was done with me, he threw money onto the bed and told me to buy some nice underwear and that he would be in touch. The minute he left, I ran a hot bath and just lay on the floor crying while I waited for it to fill. I felt so ashamed and dirty. Everything changed that day. I didn't come out of my room unless I had to. I barely ate. I hated myself. It wasn't long until he was back in touch, demanding that I see his friends. The majority were Pakistani Muslim men. If I objected, he threatened to show my parents the photos of me. I was terrified of them finding out, so I did as I was told. When the pictures didn't bother me anymore and I objected, I would get beatings instead. My ribs were kicked in several times, leaving massive bruises. I was hit with a chain, I was gang raped. I became very compliant because saying no always led to much worse. The lives of my family were threatened by Jason and his friends, amongst each other about the evil things they do to their wives. The men often spoke in groups about the horrific things they did to their wives and other women. I had to sit and listen. I was made to talk to their wives on the phone while they raped me on many occasions. They found it funny, the men. I have also been through some unimaginable things. I've had a knife held to my throat while I was raped and told by my rapist that he could kill me and then put me under the floorboards of his home, and that no one would know because he was going to Pakistan in a week. I was 16 or 17 years old. I've had a drill held to my knee while I was sat in a lounge room with around 6 other men who all laughed and talked in their own language. All of these men were Pakistani Muslims. This all happened while they were waiting for their turn to rape the girl in the other room. This is how they worked. It was a bit like a production line. I remember it all very well. I would be taken to one of many places: the back of a shop, a takeaway, a taxi office, a barber shop, wooded areas, or countryside late at night, which was terrifying. They threatened to leave me there once. Most of all, I was taken to houses or flats, on the odd occasion a hotel. A lot of the time I was taken to flats they were renovating. After some time I was no longer having to see just one man at a time, as standard. I would be taken to a flat by 2 or 3 men. When we got there, most often there would be more men waiting inside. On average, around 8 men, one after the other. I'd be put in a room and told to take off all my clothes. I would have to lay there, and each man would take his turn one after the other. Sometimes some of them would come back again. Sometimes more would show up. I wasn't allowed to move, clean myself up, until they were all finished with me. was not allowed to leave the bed, even to use the bathroom, until they said so. And most of the time there was no running water or toilet paper. At the very best there was cold running water. None of these men used protection, so I caught multiple STIs several times. I wasn't allowed to use protection. I felt disgusting, so dirty. Each time I was taken off with these men, sometimes this would happen 2 or 3 times a day. Whenever they wanted me, I had to go. Whatever time of day it was. I missed a lot of school because of this. It didn't matter if I was crying while they raped me, they would laugh and do it anyway. These are some of the things they did to me. I've had a razor blade squeezed into the palm of my hand. I've had a knife to my throat more than once, and a knife held to my stomach. I have been told how I could be murdered and put under the floorboards by a Muslim man while he raped me, holding the knife in one hand, my wrist pinned to the bed with the other. I've been taken into the woods after midnight and threatened to be left there if I didn't do as I asked. I've been peed on, spat on, slapped, kicked, punched, called a white whore. They tried to get me to marry Muslim men into the country. They wanted to take me to Pakistan a few times. Luckily for me, I didn't have a passport. I can't even count the amount of times I've been passed to Muslim groups. There were other girls, I wasn't the only one. There was a lot they did to us, none of them were ever nice. I was told that if I ever told anyone what was happening, I'd have acid poured down my throat. I remember one afternoon being taken into a room by 2 men, one being quite drunk. I tried to leave and he threw a vodka bottle at me and flew at me. His friend stopped him beating me and started to talk to him in their language. And before I knew it, I was pinned between them both, and they both raped me. They were laughing as I cried. They then made me sit with them while they finished their drinks. Eventually they allowed me to leave. I walked 2 miles to get home. I self-harmed a lot, so I'm now covered in scars. I did it at first to make myself less attractive to these men, hoping they wouldn't want to touch me. That never worked. One of them wanted to cut me some more for blood play. I've tried to commit suicide several times, as I saw no escape from this. I have no idea how I survived a recent overdose. I took 630 milligrams of codeine, along with sleeping pills and a bottle of alcohol. The last time I tried...
This would be when we first...
I'll say that at the bottom.
Yeah. Sorry.
The last time I tried to commit suicide was about 3 weeks ago. I had just found out 2 of my rapists, who I thought were dead, were actually alive. One of them has a very high position in the Pakistani government, and one of them is related to the deputy mayor of my hometown. All this pushed me over the edge. The English justice system is crap. When I was around 15, my mum called the police. The officer sent to deal with me was well over 6 feet tall, a built-up black man who I found intimidating. He seemed angry with me, asking me very intimate and upsetting questions. When I asked him to stop, he said that I'd have to get used to it, as this is what I would have to deal with in court. He told me that if I were to testify, I would get no protection. For that reason, I never took it further. The police told my mother that I was a known prostitute, and to leave me to it, I'd stop when I was ready. In anger, my mum took my phone and rang Jason. He laughed and told her what he did to me in her bed, that I loved it and couldn't keep my hands off him. After a while, I would have been about 16, my mum had to kick me out because it was all getting too much. My mental state was bad. Men were showing up at our home, hanging around in gangs outside the house, in cars. It was too much for her and she had to protect my mother too, so I had to go. I went to live in a youth hostel where things went from bad to worse. I was eventually controlled by a Muslim man in his 40s and 50s. His name was Yusuf. I have records dating back about 14 years of me trying to get help, telling medical professionals that I was gang raped and them not believing me. I have been pregnant 11 times that I know of and have had 7 abortions. I told the doctors about being gang raped, but they didn't believe me. Only 2 people ever believed me. One was a social worker and one was an occupational therapist. In 2013, a man who had been pestering me for a long time came to my house and pushed himself through my front door. He said he wanted me to find other young girls for him. I said I didn't know any and managed to get rid of him. A couple of weeks later, he put money through my door with a note saying it was a gift. He had given me his phone number, so I called him, told him I didn't want his money. I arranged to meet him to return it. He still wouldn't leave me alone. This is one of the reasons I went to live in Australia with relatives. I often feel like I'll never escape them. I've been to Australia several times to get away from them, but I'm unable to get a visa to stay there permanently. Some still see me today and talk brazenly about the things they did and still do to other girls. I'm disgusted at the lack of interest from the police and the lack of protection they have given me, despite the information I've given them. I managed to track down the identity of about 60 to 80 of these men, finding one of them on Facebook and going through his friends list. I went to tell the police. I had a meeting with 2 police officers, but while I was giving them the names, the officers stopped me and said they had to be somewhere else. They can't have done anything because I still see at least 5 of these men in my hometown driving taxis. The police said for me to press charges they would have to use my name in their reports. But these rapists know where I live. They have threatened to harm my family if I go to the police. I never get into a taxi where I live because they're all run by Pakistani Muslims, but a few weeks ago I had to use one because I was running late. The driver was one of my rapists who recognised me. He said he'd recognise my face anyway. He said that I didn't give any trouble like the other girls and tried to make me see him again. He told me that they have other girls now. This is the worst thing, they are still committing these crimes with other young British girls. He gave me his card. I took it so that I'd have his name and phone number. I went to the police with his details. They wrote his details down, but he's still driving around in a taxi. He's still raping other young girls. They ruined a big part of my life. I have moved several times, but it's ineffective. A bit of me feels frightened that if they catch me on my own, I might react in the way I used to when I was younger. I'd just do what they want, because it's easier than fighting them. Because if I did, I'd get really nasty. But now I'm mainly angry. I can't let them win. I'm afraid yet. But I am now doing what I can to get the message out there of what goes on with these gangs. That was the statement I gave at the last Marias conference. I have moved house since, which is great. No one knows where I live now. I decided last year, after giving the police anonymous information for several months, to go ahead and give them what they needed to be able to act on what I was telling them. I agreed to give an official statement that included several video statements, lots of intrusive, uncomfortable questions about what happened in more detail. This case was worked on for over a year. My medical files were accessed. I gave the police some of them myself to save time. Old police files that were originally lost were found by the officer dealing with my case. I don't know how she found them, but she did. Witnesses were spoken to, including a social worker and another girl in the same situation I was in. We were often taken together. She was younger than I was. Forensic evidence was taken from one of the rapes by 3 men in 2009 was processed for the case, but the results had shown 4 white men. They definitely weren't white, they were Pakistani men. It was explained to me how this could have happened. It's very technical, so I don't quite get it. Even after all of that, it was decided that it wouldn't go to court. Part of the reason being my memory gaps, which are there due to my PTSD, which obviously stems from being trafficked. So after all of that was for nothing. These men are still on the street to do whatever they want to girls. They still smile and wave at me when they see me in the street, which happens every single time I go for counselling. There's no way to my counsellor's office without seeing them. Sometimes they even talk to me like I'm a friend of theirs. I do think the officer working on my case did all she could, but it's not her decision at the end of it all whether it goes to court or not. By giving the official statement and working with the police to build a case, I was hoping that these men would be brought to justice so that they couldn't hurt any more girls. Now I know that's not going to happen, I'm not sure what else I can do. They said my house would be burned down while we slept.
As I said, that doesn't even include a lot of what Caitlin's had to suffer. It's, if anything, it skimmed over a lot. We've worked together now for 3 years. He said, Tony, you told me there's light at the end of the tunnel, and I want to get to the light at the end of the tunnel. Marius has been there for her for every step of the way, and we will continue to be there for you, because I love you. The same as we will be there for Roma. And that's why I think that there is strength. And when these women come forward, that's where we can build the strength from. My final guest, and then after that, the floor will be open to all of you, and you can feel free to ask any of us anything you wish. I'd like to introduce Rahil Raza, who did a video called By the Numbers, and if you haven't seen it, I would urge everybody watch it. It's one of the most powerful videos I've ever seen. So the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Tony. I'm really honoured and delighted and extremely moved, Caitlin, by your story, and wish that had been someone there for you when you needed them. But I hope now that you will find that we are all here to support you, so you won't be alone in whatever we can do. It's so difficult to speak after hearing your story, so you'll forgive me if I'm a little hesitant. And I want to thank Tony and Marius for holding this gathering and for allowing us to speak. Being the last speaker, what I thought I would do is tell you a little bit about who I am and what I do. And I hope that in your questions we'll cover some of these issues. I am a Pakistani by birth. I am a Canadian by choice. And Islam is my spiritual journey, and I say that with feeling because there is a difference between the spiritual faith and what you see happening as the politicization and the violence and the jihadist insurgency, which is a global challenge for all of us. I was born in a Sunni family. I met and fell in love with a Shia, so our children are Sushis. I have 2 grown-up boys, and I work primarily in the field of counterterrorism and human rights. I am accredited with the United Nations Human Rights Council, and I do go there thrice a year, regardless of how ineffectual they are in what they do. But I like to be a thorn in their side to remind them that human rights are above everything in the world today, and that those people who call themselves religious still need to look at religion through the lens of human rights. So the work that we do can't be encapsulated in any religious form. It's essentially for the 21st century, it is for human rights, and all the things that we are talking about today are human rights abuse. What has happened to Roma, what has happened to Caitlin, what has happened to thousands of people, and what is happening today in the name of my faith, unfortunately, is a total aberration of human rights. So we feel it our moral and ethical responsibility to speak out against these issues. But since much of the focus here today is about the Sharia councils, let me very quickly share with you that in 2003 we had a similar situation in Ontario, which is the province I live in, Canada. There was a move to establish Sharia councils because the Canadian law had a loophole in it which allowed for arbitration and mediation. And so this had been going on under the table for a while until a journalist got wind of it and it was blown open. And in 2003 we found out that there were some retired Muslim judges who were thinking of setting up official Sharia councils with permission from the government, as has happened here in the United Kingdom. I mean, let's keep in mind that the Sharia councils that operate in the UK today have the sanction of your government. They're not operating on their own. And that's something that should have never been allowed. So I am here this week to help explain to the British government how we dealt with it. So in 2003, when we heard that they wanted to get official sanction to do this, there was a huge lobby, and for 2 years we lobbied. And in this lobby, there were not just Muslims. It was civil society, it was women's organizations, it was everybody was involved. And that is the key to how we fight any kind of a battle. And this is why I'm so delighted to partner with Tony and anyone who will fight for the cause. It's not a Muslim issue when girls are raped. It is your issue and my issue. It is a global issue, and it has to be addressed in the same way. So we got together, there was a lot of media, we wrote, we spoke, for 2 years we lobbied. And in 2005, our then Premier Dalton McGuinty got rid of the law that allowed for arbitration. Now, the Jewish community that had also been practicing religious tribunals under this law felt that, the baby was thrown out with the bathwater, and there was few ramblings, but even in their situation, there were some women's issues that, had come to the surface. So essentially the law was removed. And once the law was removed, it's not as though this arbitration and mediation is not happening. It's happening under the table, because wherever there are mosques and wherever there are Wahhabi Salafi mosques, if you know what that means, the extremist political Islamist mosques, of course this goes on. There is polygamy being practiced, and there is marriage and divorce, but at least they know that it is not legal, and at least they know that we are watching them, and we make sure that they know that we are watching them. And the imams have been told that if they ever perform a marriage, it has to be registered. It has to be registered in the civil society. So we were able to do this. We got rid of the loophole that allowed this for happening. Now, of course, there are 10 provinces in Canada, so the other provinces are also sort of flexing their muscles to want to bring in. But because we were able to fight this in Ontario, we are able to try to talk to the other provinces to say, no, don't allow Sharia law. It should never have been given as an option. Because when you offer it as an option for whatever benign reason, for whatever reason which I cannot begin to imagine, a second set of laws, people will be coerced into using it. Muslim women will be coerced into using it. The argument for those who believe in Sharia councils is always, well, there's a choice. No, there's no choice. There's no choice in communities where patriarchy, misogyny, and the men rule. There is no choice for these women. They are coerced into going to them. So that's what we did in Ontario. We I have an organization called the Council for Muslims Facing Tomorrow, the focus being on the word tomorrow. We are working at bringing Muslims and Islam into the 21st century. We have a declaration. I would invite you to go to the website and look at it. We are looking at gender equality. We are looking for tolerance and compassion. We are looking to make Islam more pluralistic and to allow our youth to have an indigenous Canadian Muslim identity without any hyphens, and to address the issues of a jihadist global insurgency head on. We, of course, are faced with a silent majority where there are thousands, or I would say millions, of Muslims who do not want to address the issue, who don't want to talk about it. And when I do, I am called a heretic, and for everything from death threats to fatwas are directed at me. But of course, this is where the moral and ethical responsibility of every human being comes into place. But as I have said to Tony when she first approached me, that this is not just my battle. When we talk about women's rights, it is every woman's battle, and everyone has the right to stand up and critique and slam what is happening. Again, whether or not it's happening in the name of Islam, if it's Muslims doing it, it has to be open. We have a mandate in our organization, and I'll be very brief and then shut up so you can ask some questions. We say we use the 3 E's to expose the problem, educate the masses, and eradicate the problem. We are at the first level of exposing the problem, and that is one of the biggest difficulties. I've been involved in the production of a documentary called Honor Diaries. Again, I would invite all of you to see it if you can. It is about honor-based violence in Muslim majority societies. It deals with forced and underage marriage, which is rampant across the West. It deals with honor killings, which are on the rise in the West, and it deals with a very, very difficult issue called female genital mutilation, which is also on the rise in the West. Let me just give you one statistic, and you'll see it in this documentary, that in America there are 500,000 women, 500,000 girls and women who have either had female genital mutilation or are at risk of FG. And nobody wants to talk about it. So what has really created the worst aspect of this problem is the political correctness and the silence of the majority. So this is what we are up against. And when it comes to what the role that the governments play, I think it's a very important factor, and we definitely need to highlight. So this work that is being done is not only at a grassroots level. I'm not a scholar, I'm not an academic, I'm not a doctor, I'm just a grassroots person, a woman who's concerned about the future of my children and grandchildren, because they happen to be Western Muslims. And I feel obliged to speak out. And so for the future of our next generations, we have to speak out, both from a grassroots level and then from the top down, because essentially my message is that until the government puts into place really strict sanctions and laws, the change will not come. In Canada, I'm very proud to share with you, we were able to actually bring about a law called Zero Tolerance for Barbaric Practices about 3 years ago. And this was a part of the immigration law to stop underage marriages, forced marriages, and honor-based violence. So I'm here to support Tony, I'm here to support Marias, I'm here to hopefully help consult with the government, and I'm here to answer your questions. Thank you so much.
Now, before I open the floor to you all, what I will say is when you mention FGM, I made a note. I did a bit of research myself, and there's more than 1,200 FGM cases recorded across England in 3 months. And there are FGM cases reported in England every 109 minutes.
And these are just the reported ones, by the way.
Yes.
No.
Can I just make a comment about that?
Yes.
One of the things that really irritates me about FGM in terms of they created a new English law for it, when there was already a law that existed, and I spoke to you about it before. It's offences against the person's act, and it's GBH, grievous bodily harm, section 18, which means with intent. it carries a life sentence. Yet, for some reason, these people that sit in our parliament created a law that was watered down when women are being mutilated, and that is what it says. It is grievous bodily harm with intent. Carries a life sentence, and that's what anyone who does that type of thing should get.
Thank you. Now, I'm going to open the floor to people. If you can raise your hand, I will try and get through as many people as possible. Right, okay, one at a time. Natasha, you can go first. I'm going to open the floor to people. If you can raise your hand, I will try and get through as many people as possible. Right, okay, one at a time. Natasha, you can go first.
I've got a question for Raheel.
Yes.
With regards to educating Muslims or bringing them up to the 21st century and acting in a way that conforms with our society, do you have a plan to tackle those who do not wish to conform and those who wish to not go with the times and who are going to still want to be radical or want to, practice in a way they believe is right? Do you have a plan for them?
Yes, so here's our Muslim Reform Movement, and it is on our website. This is very new, earlier this year. So what we did in North America, and I talk about North America because Canada and USA, this is where we work. So we sent this to every single mosque, every imam, and every Islamic organization with a letter saying, this is what we're saying. And there are certain declarations in it which deal with everything that we've talked about, with human rights, gender equality, pluralism, respect for those following a different path, respect and tolerance for LGBTQ communities. We sent this to them and said, do you agree or do you not agree? And if you don't agree, you are part of the problem. You see, no one has pinpointed this to them so far. As far as those who still want to live in the West, use all the benefits that they get in the West, and yet, practice their own radicalized culture, we've offered them a one-way ticket back home. So you'll appreciate that we don't hold back. We are not politically correct by far. We've basically said, if you've come to the West by choice, you owe it to us and to yourself to accept what is, not to say that the West is perfect, not by a long shot, but you give the best of what you have and you take the best from the host country, otherwise don't come here. But it's far too late for many thousands and millions of immigrants who are already here. What I want to share with you very quickly, if you'll is you must remember one basic thing that very few people will tell you. Today, and I'm talking about what's happening, let's say in the last 5 or 10 years, the three major influences on Muslims in the West, it doesn't matter where they are. In Europe, I just went to 3 major cities in Europe on a fact-finding mission, and I was appalled. A civil war is brewing there. And the reason is that the influences on Muslims, whether they're educated or not, is only from 3 sources. It's from 3 sources only. One is Wahhabi Salafi Islam, which tells them that there's only one way of practicing Islam, and anyone else who doesn't do it, including me and her, you are all heretics, you are out of the faith. The second influence among the Shias is from Khomeiniism. And ism, I say, is because this is all political. None of this is spiritual. They're not telling you how to worship God in a better way. They're telling you how to defeat the system, how to spread your insidious subversive agendas, and how not to be a good Britisher or a good Canadian or a good American. And the third one is this Al-Qaeda, Taliban, that strain. And so those are the only 3 influences. This is why you see young, educated Western youth going to fight for ISIS. And what we have to do is focus on these 3 influences, whether they're coming through the mosques, whether they're coming through Islamist organizations, and we Muslims have to be the frontline warriors in this battle, and we need your support, because they want to kill us as well. Don't forget that. They want to. So that's what we are doing.
I'll get you a shield. The lady at the back there.
Just a question with regards to the councils that are going on, the Sharia councils in Great Britain that we know are obviously supposed to be arbitrating. How are they monitored? Because to impersonate a judge carries a 5 to 7, I can't remember, but it carries a sentence. To to impersonate a judge is illegal in this country. So how did we get to this point?
But they're not monitored. They're not monitored, is it? Sorry?
Can I answer that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Go for it.
They're not monitored. They make rulings. Most of it is about divorce. It's the government's view is, well, they should be allowed to do what they want, but at the same time the government has initiated an inquiry into these Sharia councils. But there are problems with that inquiry because the terms of reference are about how can it be compatible with English law or best practice and that sort of thing, rather than whether they should exist. And they put a Muslim scholar at the head of it, and they put 2 imams on the panel, and they haven't put any human rights people on the panel. So the government inquiry...
Are there any women on that panel?
Yes, it's chaired by a woman, but there aren't human rights people with human rights expertise on that panel, and Rahil's quite right, this is all about human rights really. So that inquiry has actually been boycotted by high-profile people, including Ellen Manea, who wrote this book, Women in Sharia Law, a professor, and about Sharia courts. But there is a separate inquiry by the Parliamentary Select Committee, the Home Office Select Committee into Sharia councils that has not been boycotted, that all these people have given evidence to, and that inquiry may well come up with good evidence and good recommendations. So we'll see. But the status is that they're not formally monitored in the way you're saying, and the government is inquiring into what do we do about this. Rather than adopting Baroness Cox's bill, what they're saying is we want to wait for the inquiry and then decide what to do. So that's where we're at the moment.
Mark.
Okay, just a couple of points. Rahel, you mentioned human rights, and I just wonder, on your thoughts, how you see human rights fitting in with some of the context of the Quran and Hadith, and how you believe that you may be able to push a more human rights agenda within Islam, considering some of the texts that all of us, well, a lot of us here that have read, and the practices that we've seen.
Well, there is a difference between, thank you, that's an excellent question. There's a difference between the text and the practices. We are able to find human rights support within the text. The practices, which you may call the hadith or the secondary commentary, is all very, very problematic. And we want to sort of push that aside. Also, when we speak, or when you speak of the Quran, we have to remind you that it's a 7th century text in a certain historical context at a time and place when the situation was very different. Part of our reform movement is to bring Muslims and the practice of Islam today into the 21st century, which means that you have to let go of some of those notions. And I'll give you a perfect example. The notion of armed jihad was valid in the 7th century because there were no boundaries, there were no border states, there were no nations, there were tribal communities. So we are saying, leave it in the 7th century, park it in the 7th century, and let's come to more humanistic.
How do you think that's going to happen when a lot of Muslims that I speak to say that the Quran is obviously the word of God and it cannot be changed and it is political?
Well, I never said it was going to be easy. and
as a woman, I'm sure you find even more.
Yes, of course there are many challenges, but I will remind you that the Christian reform took 500 years. So we have just started 5 months ago, and so I'm not suggesting that this is a change that's going to come overnight. But somewhere, someone has to sow the seeds of change. Somewhere, someone from within the faith has to stand up and criticize what is happening in the name of the faith. Now, the very important concepts of the faith have been sidelined for the more violent, for the really radicalized ideas. What we want to do is create an alternate narrative that will subsume the other narrative. And it's going to take a lot of time, but we're working at it, and we've started.
Perhaps you might be able to answer this. You work within government, or you work with people that work within the government. What is your opinion or your feelings on the obstructions that the government seem to put in place for those that are talking about Islam and or political Islam, more precisely? When I myself and a lot of others here that have educated themselves a little bit on it, and we say stuff, we're immediately labelled as racist, bigots, Islamophobes, etc., etc., etc. And this is coming from the government, and they seem to be more compliant or complacent about it. They don't seem to care, even though we had David Cameron I think it was last year, come up and say that some of this abuse has been committed on an industrial scale, and yet at the same breath they still want to do business with countries like Saudi Arabia and take their money into this country. To me, as a guy on the street, it just seems they're interested about money and not the people who they're supposed to be representing. I wonder if you have any feedback from people within government that you have been dealings with.
Yeah, I mean, I sympathise entirely with what you say. I think that there are some promising signs. You quoted David Cameron. In Baroness Cox's statement, I quoted Theresa May, acknowledging that these things are happening, so at least they're not denying that they're happening and that it's sanctioned by aspects of Sharia law as well. And at least they've initiated these inquiries, right? So there are some positive signs that something's happening. When Baroness Cox's bill was debated in Parliament, I was there in the House of Lords, and there's about 20 Lords who spoke, and if it was 20, 19 of them spoke in favour of Baroness Cox's bill and one spoke against. It was Lord Ahmed, and he was given a tough time. He was given a tough time, I can tell you. You know, so the broad support from people in the House of Lords was big, and there are a number of MPs as well who support what Baroness Cox is doing. And I think Fiona Bruce has tabled it as her private member's bill, but of course that requires a ballot. So there are people who are willing to confront this and speak up about it. And then, of course, part of the frustration that people have with mainstream politics is leading to organisations like UKIP and people, grassroots people supporting other political movements that are not willing to toe the political correct line and are happy to speak out about this. So I think you're going to see more of that kind of thing, and I hope that we'll see some change as a result of these inquiries going on.
If I can go to Eddie, and then after Eddie, I've actually got a question for Raheel myself. But I'd like.
If you look at our history of the suffragette movement, because I mean, what you're talking about is the gender equality. Really is where we're going to go around it. I mean, religious element does take you into some very ambiguous areas. Especially I come from a quite a religious background myself, so from a Christian side. But actually, when you look at that, the suffragette movement had to go outside the law. They had to be prepared to actually step outside because the law did not accommodate it or listen to those concerns. What type of response have you had as a group from women's groups, on equality issues? What type of resistance have you had from those groups as well?
Are you talking to me about?
Yeah,
okay.
Actually to the panel, really.
Okay.
I mean, when you look at it, because that's the only way I can see forward is actually women coming together in a stronger movement. And what type of response have you had with that?
Well, very interesting question.
Yeah,
so,
I'd say that.
Mainstream Western feminist groups don't want to touch us with a 10-foot pole. I would love to know why that is. Our film, we had a pushback. Yes, and this is a very important point that you had brought up. You would think that when we're talking about just gender equality, forget the religious part of it. Every community has gone through the challenges of that. You think that we'd get all the support? No, we don't. We get pushback because many of them are funded by the government, and this is due respect. I don't mean, and they don't want to shake the balance. And then they come up with academic terms which I don't even understand, about cultural relativity and all. And I tell them, don't give me bullshit. Excuse me. If a woman is, and it happens. Academic institutions and women's groups slam us shut, because they don't want to shake the balance, they don't want to shake their tenure, they don't want to be unpopular. It's a simple question. Do you accept violence against women or you don't? Really, black and white. And they won't answer that in yes or no. They'll say, but this culture, and you have to respect culture. I'm sorry, but a culture that abuses women, no respect. You have to speak out.
And I can tell you in my personal experience, I've contacted multiple, I'm not going to name them, shame them, but maybe I will in a later video. I contacted multiple so-called feminists, and I will say so-called feminists, because I don't believe they're feminists, they are feminazis. They just hate men, they have penis envy.
That's right.
I don't. I like the differences between men and women, but I believe every man has the right to be a feminist and defend the rights of women in this country. And that's one of the reasons when I started Maria's, I chose the colours of the suffragettes. And so many people have forgotten what real feminism is about. And what you've got is these men hating women, and they're also apologists. They're very left-leaning and they're apologists. And as Rahil, she's right. The minute you mention it, they go, well, yeah, but it's cultural. Well, in that case, that culture doesn't fit in my country, so we shouldn't be here. End of. And what you should be doing is standing with me instead of calling a load of hate. So the feminists that they call themselves, modern-day feminists, won't touch it.
Can I just go?
Sorry.
What about union support? Because I do think actually
We don't get any of that.
you don't get any trade union support.
Nope.
Because
Do you get any trade union support? No. Do you get any trade union support? I'm just going along the panel. No, none of us get that. But if you could offer it, that would be brilliant. I'm trying to get for as many people as possible. So back.
There's a report by is it Casey report coming out through the government at the moment, and because it doesn't fit the government narrative, they are quoting saying that it needs a major rewrite. How do we get the original report to the public?
There's the government.
So yes, I read up on this week, and in fact I wrote an article about it on the Christian Concern website if you want to look at that. I think Baroness Casey, by the sound of things, has written a very robust critique of multiculturalism and of the government's policy on immigration and on integration. Of course, that reflects on Theresa May when she was Home Secretary. It's very critical of Islam and some of the issues around Islam in respect to that. And she's been quite outspoken. She's said that we should have a vigorous defence of Christmas. She's criticised Islamic schools that are state funded, that close on Fridays for prayers. And she said a number of other issues about this. And you're quite right, in the news this week, it was on the Sun Times last week actually, it was revealed that the government's trying to censor this report or suppress it. Now, I hope they don't, but Baroness Casey, I'm encouraged, has said that she won't be silenced. And she said that she will put it out and publish it no matter what, even whether the government wants it or not. She said, something like, if you employ a bigwig, you're going to get what I say. And, you employ a Muppet and you get what a Muppet says. But I'm a bigwig. So, she says she's going to publish it, so I really hope that she does publish it and that puts pressure on the government about these issues.
Okay, next. Any more questions, please? Sam, over there. I will come to you just a minute, Jan.
I've got 4 questions.
Come on then, let's have all 4 in one go. Can you speak up a little bit, because we're struggling to hear you.
You said at the beginning you wanted to do things differently, other movements that have come before. I just wondered if you could clarify what you meant there, like differently how.
Differently because when I hear people talk about unity, and you hear them talk about unity all the time, we need to unite, what they really mean in truth, they mean the far right need to unite. I don't think that that's the answer. I think that people like Rahil, and people like Roma, people like Tanvir, people like Caitlin, people like Tim, and all of these people in these rooms, this is the way you bring people together. But there has to be, what I've found is that the reason you're seeing this so-called rise of the far right isn't because they're racist or bigots or fascists or Nazis. They're angry. And the reason they're angry is because we get constantly told about the rising tide of Islamophobia. Nobody ever talks about the effects that it's having on the non-Muslim community. So they're never heard. Their concerns aren't heard. But when you get a street movement, they take to the streets, you've got one speaker, your first 10 people might hear, but once you get a little bit further, they're not hearing what's being said. Therefore, it becomes a bit of a Jolly Boys outing. This, to me, this is more productive because people are actually getting a chance to put questions to people, and I hope to put people on the panel along with Rahil, along with Roma, that will maybe be a little bit extreme the other way, and people will get the chance to ask them those questions too, because I think that's the only way. There has to be dialogue, and we have to put the pressure on them too. It has to work both ways. That's what I mean by different.
Sorry, Tony, but on that point, may I point out the National Union of Journalists diversity policy? Its only mention of the indigenous white population of this country is the rise of the far right. It also states that any organisation labelled racist, that the media need not interview them. So when Wayman Bennett calls anybody a racist, they're immediately made persona non grata and ignored. So when a white person says, "Excuse me, there's something wrong with my country," it's "shut up, you Nazi."
But do you not think that then, in that case, having someone like Raheel sitting there and backing your corner and saying, well, actually, they're not racist, actually, they're not intolerant, they have issues, they have concerns, you are ignoring the people of this country. You need to listen to them.
That's why I'm here.
And that's where Raheel, Roma, people like this will make a massive difference in pushing that forward, where we shut down this Islamophobe label.
By the way, I just want to add for your reference, they call me the Merry Muslim because I lobbied for 10 years for Canadians to be able to celebrate Christmas and wish anyone they want a Merry Christmas.
Now, Sam, you said you had 4 questions, so...
I'll shorten it to 3. You had Caitlin's story there, which I'm sure everyone will agree was incredibly moving, very brave.
Can I get you to speak up, Sam? I know you're loud in this, I've heard your videos.
Yeah. My question is for Raheel. Why do you think Pakistani Muslim men are overrepresented? Is it religious? Is it cultural? Why are we seeing an overrepresentation in the statistics?
I'm sorry, what exactly do you mean by overrepresented? I mean,
in rape gangs.
Grooming gangs.
Can I also add to
yes,
this?
please.
Yes, absolutely.
The thing is, where I've been looking at this issue is there's a big problem with gender equality when it comes to Pakistani Muslims. And where I've seen them literally seeing, they have got a certain vision about women. And as soon as those women do not fit that they're the way their idea of women should be, like not covering up, wearing skirts, putting makeup, etc., that's when they think this woman is literally less of them. They don't deserve as much respect as them. Hence, they are taken as cheap commodities. Hence, you would find a lot of Muslim men, when they see a white woman, she's cheaper, she hasn't got the same status as me, as a Pakistani woman from my country. Hence, she could be slept with and then used and then thrown. And this is what we are finding also. When I was doing a TV show at TV99, I remember I used to get a lot of phone calls, not just from British Muslim women who have been brought up in this country, want to follow as much more westernized, and kept on screaming the same thing. My husband thinks I'm a whore. My husband has left me because he says I cannot live with another Muslim woman in this country, but I'm going to go back home and get married from back home because you're just not the same as me.
Do you think it's an Islam issue or a Pakistan?
I would say it's definitely a Pakistan issue.
there's also, if I may add to what Roma has says, and something which very few people want to talk about, there's also a lot of sexual repression in the communities, because they're being told by the mosque culture that, sex outside of marriage is a sin, and that you have to be, all of this. So there's a lot of sexual repression, and it comes out because they have been told by someone. And this is where it's important to know what the messaging is. But they're being taught that it's okay to use a white woman because she's not a Muslim, and it's okay to maltreat her or rape her, and you can get away with it. And this is again a process that has come through this politicization of the faith to use the sexual repression of these men. All through ISIS and all of that, you see the sexual repression issue. Why else would they think that they are going to get 72 virgins when they blow themselves up in a suicide bomb? I mean, that's a bunch of baloney. This is some wishful thinking of a very, very sick man, and it's not in the faith, but they've been told this. So everything has a sexual connotation, and then it manifests itself in these ways, especially when they know that they can get away with it. And this is what Caitlin's story tells me.
Can I ask you, Caitlin, why do you think, because the girls are predominantly white, and that's not to say there hasn't been Sikh girls targeted, because there has, and I actually believe Muslim women are also being raped, but they can't come forward and say that. But why do you think, Caitlin, that you were targeted?
Because I'm white.
And I think that kind of, and to me, a racist crime is racist if the victim believes she's been targeted because of her skin, or if a man believes he's targeted because of the colour of his skin. Not one girl who has been targeted has had her attack recognised as being racially motivated. So we are dismissed that we can't say that what you've done is racist. I can only be a racist. Nothing against me or Caitlin can be a racist attack. And that's another thing that's got to be looked at. And this is why one of the things that I'm hoping Raheel will agree to do, I would like to work out the stats and work with you and do the research and find the stats of attacks from Muslims against non-Muslims. Because we've only got the stats of so-called Islamophobic attacks.
Yes, let's
and
do
it would be good to see whether or not they measure up. Sorry, can I just... I've got. Can I go to this lady first and then you? Is that okay?
If you want to pick up on a point, you can.
It's just a quick point. Something said about Pakistan and sort of sexuality and stuff like this. I recently watched, I think it was Channel 4, Pakistan's Hidden Shame, and they were talking about the way that women are portrayed within the Quran and the Hadith and stuff like this. They're sheltered, so it was forcing the men to go and rape boys, and it was on a massive scale. I believe Imran Khan was interviewed and he was completely shocked by it. So you say it was a cultural thing, and yet the guys that were interviewed during the programme were saying it was because of their religion that they felt that they couldn't touch the women or go near the women because it was the religious teachings that were telling them this. So I'm not 100% sure or agreement whether we would say it was a cultural thing or whether it is a religious thing as well. Go ahead and attest to me from what the guy was saying.
For many people growing up, and especially in countries like Pakistan, there's a very fine line between culture and religion. It's totally smudged. They are told many facts that it's part of religion when it's not. So it is what they're being taught. It's the teachings. It doesn't have to be necessarily part of the faith. I mean, 50% of what they're being told is garbage in the name of the faith. But they're being taught this. They're being taught this in madrasas, they're being taught this in Islamic schools, they're being taught this in the mosques, they're being taught this at home. So yes, and a lot of it goes down to how they're brought up. The patriarchy and the misogyny, the power and control of the males over the females, which permeates the entire culture, is very much a part of it.
Is it just a cultural thing for Pakistan, or is it a cultural thing within the entire Islamic world?
You know, it's very hard to talk about the entire Islamic world because you're talking about such a large majority of people who come from a variety of different backgrounds. I mean, the Islamic world now exists in the West as well, but the thinking is different. I mean, my boys are Pakistani heritage Muslim boys, but they don't think the same way as other people do. So the upbringing, where you grow up, your education, your vision, all of this plays into it. I cannot make a generalized statement about all Muslims because that would never be fair. I don't speak for all Muslims because they are very varied.
I'll come to you.
Saudi says he does.
Sorry. Yeah. Well, anyone who says they speak for all Muslims is lying, obviously.
I wanted to ask a question to you, Roma, about your experiences sort of growing up in this country. I'm thinking about after the Trojan Horse scandal, I'm sure most of you here know that the then Education Secretary Michael Gove brought in a responsibility on schools to teach what he called British values to children to kind of ensure that everyone in this country was growing up feeling, I guess, in some way British. Do you think that, obviously having grown up in this country, that there was enough opportunity for you to become a British citizen in a cultural sense? And do you think that having some sort of program in school that helped you know about British history and British values, whatever they may be, would have aided in perhaps kind of pushing back against kind of what happened to you? Does that make sense?
Let me correct a bit of what I think a lot of people don't understand, is not to be sounding, politically
correct or incorrect.
I find a lot of the problems are being brought into UK by overseas Pakistanis. When they're coming here, because they've been brought up, have been educated, what influence they're having on our youngsters is something we need to be really taken into account. I remember my husband, who was born in Pakistan, brought up, educated. What he would do is then he would ask a few of his friends, there's a Pakistani scholar who's come over, these being British Muslims, Western, quite Western, would then say, what is it about? And he would sort of groom them to actually come to these events, to be actually, and this is what Islam is about, this is what you need to be doing, this is how you treat women, this is how so these boys which were one Western, have been groomed by the friendships that they've had made with these other Pakistani who come to be starting to actually take those and adopt that lifestyle. Whereas when I was growing up in the 80s, I think we did have some understanding about the British culture, but a lot of it actually transpired from my parents as well. My mother said we came to the UK by choice, and we are going to adopt the British culture as it is. We're going to take those values as it is. Now, what you, for example, talking about British values, one of the few things my mother used to say, when you see an elderly person or somebody queuing up, we queue up outside the buses and wait for the buses. How many of the immigrants do that? Do they actually form a straight line outside the bus, or do they push in? They've already induced a culture in us. This is exactly what's happening from the overseas immigration, that they are bringing the culture over to us. So before we start teaching them, we need to be teaching the people who are coming in to understand the British values. When you board the bus, you need to queue up. If you get onto the bus and you see the elderly, get up.
Yep. But that's not even a British value, that's a human value, I would say, right? That's something that you learn at your mother's knee. Yes, but I agree with you, and what you're talking about, we call it excess cultural baggage. Yeah. We say that immigrants bring excess cultural baggage. They need
we'll
to
get
leave
to you
it
in one second, as soon as...
I just want to say in relation to this question about Pakistanis and Islam, is that some of what they're doing can be justified from the text. That's not to say most Muslims know that. Most Muslims don't know that. But Muhammad endorsed sex slavery in certain contexts. If you read the traditions, his biographies, the hadiths, you can find that in there. Most Muslims don't even know that, but there are some that do, and so there is a problem with that in that respect.
Just one, right, John, and then the lady at the back.
Okay, it's a question for Rahil. I'm struggling with how you reform Islam. What do you do in addressing Muhammad? Okay, so if Muhammad is the inventor of Islam, and if you look at what Islam's doctrine tells us about the facts, his life, what he did, what are you going to do with him? What position does he take in your reformed Islam? Okay. And do you still acknowledge him as the messenger of God, the perfect human being who has to be emulated by all Muslims? What do you do with Muhammad?
Well, 1.6 billion Muslims in the world revere Muhammad, and so do I. That is something that comes from being a Muslim. We follow the Quran. Now, he was not the inventor of Islam. Muslims believe that he received a revelation, and that revelation was then produced in the form of the Quran as the word of God, and 1.6 billion Muslims do believe that. Now, to shake that is not going to happen. Neither are they going to convert, neither are they going to leave that belief. The questioning that comes with it on whether or not today what we read as the Quran is the exact word of God, or whether it was created by man, or whether a part of it was Muhammad's own invention, is something that can be discussed. What we say is that it does not impact the way we live our lives today. And we need to, the questioning that we have, we need to park it, and we need to move on ahead with those values that are common to humanity.